All right, so hopefully you had a little chance to think about the state of the paddle. Let's think about this kind of together. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? It's a lot like the ball. It's our second class, which is why I wanted you to think about it. But we have this paddle, right? We can think about, and I'll just keep it general for right now. Position. Well, who cares? Let's just do it. I didn't want to give it away, but X position, right? Y position, that'll tell you the top left of the paddle, right? So that's the current state of the paddle. And then we've got width of the paddle. So paddle width, maybe. And paddle height. Okay? And whether it's the CPU paddle or the user paddle, they're both gonna have these variables. Okay? So there's something similar between the CPU paddle and the user paddle. There's also something different between the CPU paddle and the user paddle. So the user paddle is going to move based on the mouse. Okay? And the CPU paddle, well, that's going to move automatically somehow. Okay, so we have to figure that out. Okay, and so their moves are going to be different. So they're both paddles. They both share something. Okay, but how we update their position from one frame to another, how their move changes, how they change, is going to be a completely different mechanism. So what do we do if we have a situation like this? Well, right here, one thing that we have is we have two objects that are practically the same except for a few differences. Their implementation of one of their methods, or the implementation of one of their actions, maybe I shouldn't say methods because we're not sure how that's going to work right now, is going to be different. Let's talk about that. So we have the notion of a paddle, okay? And we decided our paddle is going to have an X position, a Y position, a paddle width, and paddle height. And if you did like colors and stuff like that, that's fine too. You could have, I mean, all of those are, I mean, the color is something that would be a current state of the paddle, right? What it looks like right now, that's fine. But so we have an X position, Y position, a paddle width, and a paddle height. Okay, and if you give me those things, then I can be like, well, I can draw this at X position, Y position, right? That's our top left corner. I can have a width and a height. Okay, so that's our paddle. Okay, I don't know, we can do something like this, right? Okay, and I can draw it, and it's not, I could draw it, you know, if you give me numbers for these things, I can draw it anywhere. Okay. But we have a computer paddle and a user paddle. Okay? So we might have a computer paddle. And a user paddle. And we might say, hey, we want both the computer paddle and the user paddle to have all of these variables. Okay? But what we want is we want the paddle to say, well, I'm a paddle, but I'm a generic paddle. Okay? So we don't know how we update the paddle position here. Okay? And the reason this paddle, the general paddle, doesn't know how to update paddle position is because, well, a computer paddle will update its position one way automatically, right? And a user paddle will update its position another way through the mouse. So what we're basically saying here is that these two things are paddles. They share the same state variables, okay? But they do one thing a little differently, okay? And sometimes they might not even share the same state variables. You can add more state variables to user paddle. But what's happening here is what we're going to do is we're going to use inheritance. And so computer paddle and user paddle will inherit from this base class paddle. Okay, base class. Remember universal base class. So we'll come back to that. So we're inheriting from paddle. What does it mean when we inherit from paddle? Well, it means we get all of the private variables, okay? We can't actually get them directly. We have to use getters and setters to get the private variables. But we get all the private variables. So user paddle has its own paddle inside of it with all these private variables. And we get all the functions, okay? Now, another thing I said is that paddle is going to be an abstract class, okay? And what an abstract class is it's a class you never make, you only inherit from you never make an object of an abstract class. And why can't you make an object of this class? Well, because it has a function, all right, that is not defined, okay? In this case, update paddle position will be a function that paddle will have in it, but it won't have a body to it. It will be something that will be an abstract function, and that means it has to be overridden by a class that inherits from paddle, okay? And so computer paddle needs to, if it inherits from paddle, needs to give a definition to update paddle position. And user paddle, when it inherits from paddle, needs to give a definition for update paddle position, okay? And if you give those things, then we can make instances of a user paddle or objects of a user paddle and instances of a computer paddle, right? And we save some code because our paddle is defined all of these private variables and getters and setters for them, okay? And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel with that. So we don't have to create two different classes, okay? But these classes, each one of these is going to do a little different kind of implementation of the paddle movement. So let's actually put that together, but I'm going to ask you a few questions before we start doing that. See you in the next video.